Picture the toughest rally on the planet. Broken roads carved through mud and rock. Flash floods that swallow entire sections of track without warning. Heat that cracks engine blocks in half before lunch. And cold nights that freeze fuel lines solid before dawn. Cars built like tanks, driven by the best professionals money could buy in that era. Backed by factory budgets most privateers could only dream about. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a small Swedish sedan that looked like it had wandered in from the wrong decade, boxy, rounded at the back, like a turtle shell. Almost comical, parked next to the sleek, modern machines lined up around it. Nobody expected it to survive the first day, let alone finish the race. But it didn't just finish, it won. And that single result changed how the entire world looked at a car nobody had taken seriously. This is the story of the Volvo PV544, a car that looked outdated before it even left the factory floor, a car that engineers in other countries quietly laughed at behind closed doors, and a car that, against every reasonable expectation, became one of the most feared competitors in motorsport history. Stick with me, because what happened to this old-fashioned Swedish box is one of the greatest underdog stories the automotive world has ever produced. And by the end, you'll understand why looks have never told the real story of what something is actually capable of. To understand why this car looked the way it did, you have to go back further than most people realize. Back to 1944, in the middle of a world at war. Sweden wasn't in the fighting, but it wasn't untouched either. Materials were scarce, money was tight, and Volvo needed something that could keep the company alive, not something that could win trophies at a concours event. So, when the PV444 was introduced to a car-starved Swedish public that year, it wasn't designed to turn heads. It was designed to survive, to be affordable, and to get families through hard, uncertain times. The response from ordinary Swedes was overwhelming. Orders poured in almost immediately. But it would take another 3 years, until 1947, before the factory could actually begin full production. That delay tells you something important about this car's character. It wasn't rushed out to chase a style trend. It was built slowly, carefully, with an emphasis on strength over appearance. And from the very beginning, people noticed something odd about it. The design already looked behind the times, even brand new. Critics called it dated from day one. Some even joked it looked like a car that had been designed a decade earlier and simply forgotten in a drawer. People in Sweden even gave it a nickname because of that rounded, sloping rear end. They called it the hunchback, not exactly the kind of nickname that sells cars in a glossy advertisement. But somehow, that same awkward shape became a badge of honor among the people who actually drove it hard. Because underneath the hunchback nickname was a growing reputation for being rugged and sporty in ways its looks never suggested. Here's the detail almost nobody talks about, though. While people were busy judging the shape, the car was quietly earning a reputation for something far more valuable than good looks: toughness. Real, mechanical, bone-deep toughness. Under that rounded, old-fashioned body sat a unibody construction, a genuine engineering advance for its time, built for punishment, not for photographs. And punishment was exactly what was coming its way. In August of 1958, Volvo introduced an updated version of the car, officially badged the PV544, featuring the most extensive changes since the original design had appeared back in 1944. The windshield grew larger and more curved. The rear window expanded for better visibility. Inside, engineers added a new dashboard with a padded upper section, a small but telling sign that safety, not just style, was starting to matter to this company in a way few competitors were thinking about yet. Even the speedometer had a strange, almost playful design, a red strip climbing upward like a thermometer as speed increased. None of this made headlines. None of it was flashy. But all of it mattered, because this was a company quietly obsessing over substance, while the rest of the world judged it on shape. And underneath that unremarkable body, Volvo eventually offered a genuine performance version of this car, running the same 1800 cubic centimeter engine found in family models, but fitted with a dual carburetor setup instead of the standard single carburetor. It wasn't a flashy addition. There was no badge screaming for attention, no dramatic bodywork change to announce it. Just more power, quietly added underneath a shape that still looked exactly like your neighbor's grocery getter. That's the entire philosophy of this car, in one small mechanical detail. Improve what's underneath. Never bother changing what's on top. And it's worth remembering that Volvo wasn't some brand new company gambling blindly on motorsport for the very first time. The company's involvement in competition actually stretched back to 1928, just a year after Volvo itself was founded. So, when this odd little sedan started turning heads on racetracks and rally stages, it wasn't a fluke, born from nowhere. It was the continuation of a philosophy that had been quietly building inside this company for decades, one that valued endurance over elegance, long before anyone outside Sweden was paying much attention. By 1958, in the United States, the car had already started proving itself in ways that mattered far more than a magazine cover ever could. At the Sports Car Club of America endurance races at Lime Rock, Volvos didn't just compete. They swept the field, filling the first 5 positions in one of the toughest club racing environments in the country. That same model won the series outright in 1958, and then did it again in 1961. 2 different years, same result. That's not luck, that's a pattern. And patterns are exactly what separate a fluke from a genuine threat on the track. Volvo noticed the pattern too. In 1959, the company made a decision that would define this car's legacy forever. It created its own competition department, a dedicated team built to take this so-called outdated little sedan and push it into the hardest arenas in motorsport on purpose. This wasn't an accident anymore. This was a plan, and a genuinely unusual one for the time. Most manufacturers built one car to sell to families and an entirely different, glamorous machine to chase trophies with. Volvo didn't bother. They simply took the same boxy sedan sitting in driveways across Sweden and handed it to professional drivers, betting that the very toughness built into every ordinary family car would translate directly onto the world's harshest stages. And in 1960, that plan paid off in brutal fashion. Driver Gunnar Andersson took a PV544, fitted with a B16 engine, and drove it through the Gran Premio de Argentina, a grueling endurance rally stretching 4,620 kilometers across punishing, unforgiving terrain. He won. The victory made headlines across the world. A white Volvo, a car originally built for cautious Swedish families, had just conquered one of the hardest rallies on the planet. That's the moment. People should have stopped laughing at the shape. Most of them didn't, not yet. Subscribe now if you want more true stories like this one, where the underdog nobody believed in ends up rewriting the history books. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story like it, and if this one is already pulling you in, drop a comment telling me which part has surprised you the most so far. Now let's get into the part where this car stopped being a surprise and started becoming a legend. Because after Argentina, Volvo didn't slow down, they doubled down. In 1961, Gunnar Andersson himself was appointed manager of the competition department, though he kept competing personally whenever he could. And under his leadership, the company signed a roster of genuinely talented drivers who understood exactly what this strange little sedan could do if it was pushed correctly. Carl Magnus Skog joined the effort, along with Iwi Rosqvist, who drove the PV544 for the factory team across 1959, 1960, and 1961, winning the European Ladies Rally Championship in all 3 of those years before eventually moving on to a Mercedes-Benz factory contract. But one name rose above the rest: Tom Trana. If you don't recognize that name, you should, because in the world of 1960s rallying, Trana was as respected as any driver alive, anywhere in the world. And he chose the PV544 as his weapon of choice. In 1963, Trana drove that Volvo to victory at the British Rack Rally, beating seasoned competitors on their own home turf. on roads they knew far better than he ever could. The following year, 1964, he took the same car to first place at the Acropolis Rally in Greece, a race notorious for chewing up machinery on brutal, unforgiving mountain terrain. Then, in 1965, he added another win, this time at the Rally of Sweden, on home ground, in front of a country that had once quietly doubted its own homegrown car. And it wasn't only rallying. Around this same period, Volvo pushed the PV544 into touring car and endurance racing too, and the car dominated there as well, including strong results at both the 6-hour and 12-hour endurance races held at the Nürburgring, one of the most demanding and unforgiving circuits ever built anywhere in the world. Different discipline. Different kind of punishment entirely. Same result, race after race. 3 major international victories in rallying alone. 3 completely different types of terrain. 3 separate years. This wasn't a lucky streak anymore. This was proof, hammered home again and again, that the outdated shape everyone kept mocking was hiding something the competition simply couldn't match. Reliability that refused to break under pressure. An engine that kept delivering power when others gave out entirely. A car built by people who understood that winning has absolutely nothing to do with how something looks, sitting still, in a showroom. But nothing Volvo had achieved up to this point prepared the world for what was coming next. Because the toughest test of all was still ahead, and it would turn one specific, battered PV544, and one specific underdog driver into a permanent piece of motorsport legend. In 1964, Volvo made a bold and expensive move. They sent 4 brand new PV544s all the way to Kenya, aiming to conquer the East African Safari Rally, widely considered the single most brutal endurance rally on the entire calendar. This wasn't a paved circuit with clean, comfortable pit stops and cheering crowds lining every corner. This was thousands of kilometers of mud, dust, flash floods, wandering wildlife, and roads that barely deserved to be called roads at all. That year alone, 94 cars lined up at the starting line. Only 21 of them ever crossed the finish. Drivers who competed in it described it less like a race and more like a war of attrition against the landscape itself. Even Tom Trana, the very same driver who had already conquered the RAC Rally and the Acropolis Rally behind the wheel of this car, couldn't escape the 1964 Safari Rally unbeaten. He crashed his PV544 out on that brutal Kenyan terrain, one of 3 Volvo team cars that failed to make it through those preliminary rounds. 3 cars, gone, sent back to Sweden in quiet defeat, their engineers left to wonder what had gone wrong. For a moment, it looked like the toughest rally on earth had finally found the one opponent this stubborn little car couldn't beat, but that crashed car never actually left Kenya. Instead, it sat there, waiting, until a Kenyan driver named Joginder Singh entered into a hire purchase agreement to buy it, 5 months before the next Safari Rally was set to begin. Singh had already spent years competing in smaller regional rallies, and he used his own considerable mechanical knowledge to repair and strengthen that same battered machine, the exact car Tom Trana himself had wrecked, specifically for brutal African conditions. Nobody handed him a factory-fresh machine. He got the leftover, the wrecked one, the very car a champion had already crashed and walked away from. Before the race even began, Singh told interviewers something remarkable, something that shows exactly how low the expectations really were. He said he'd simply be happy to finish the race, not win it. Just finish it. That's it. That's what everyone, including the driver himself, believed was realistically possible. That's the part I want you to sit with for a second, because it's easy to hear a story like this after the fact and assume everyone somehow knew how it would end. They didn't. Nobody believed in that car. Nobody believed in that driver. The odds were about as far from his favor as they could possibly be, and there wasn't a single expert in that paddock who would have bet money on the outcome that actually happened. Then, in April of 1965, Joginder Singh and his brother and co-driver, Jaswant Singh, took that patched-up, doubted, second-hand PV544 through one of the harshest endurance tests in motorsport history, and they didn't just survive it. They won it outright. The East African Safari Rally. The exact same race that had already destroyed 3 brand new Volvos from the very same team just months earlier. Conquered by the one car nobody wanted, driven by the one man nobody expected anything from. The victory made news across the globe almost overnight. A car with a shape people had been quietly mocking for over a decade had just beaten the toughest rally on earth, using the leftover machine and an underdog driver nobody had taken seriously going in. That's not a footnote buried in automotive history. That's one of the greatest underdog stories this sport has ever produced, and it happened because a company refused to let outdated looks define what their engineering was actually capable of underneath. Now, here's the part that turns this from a great story into something almost impossible to believe. This wasn't a one-off. This wasn't a lucky year that quietly faded into memory. This car simply refused to stop winning. In 1968, a PV544 took bronze at one of Sweden's national rallies, still proving itself against far newer machinery on its own home soil. Decades after that, one particular PV544, built to full FIA homologation specification and campaigned for years by a British family of dedicated rally entrants, took second place in the Monte Carlo Challenge in 1992, finishing just 1 single second behind the winner. 3 years later, in 1995, that same car returned to Monte Carlo and won its class outright. Over the years, that one determined little sedan collected victories and podiums across 6 separate Monte Carlo winter challenges, 4 winter trials, 8 classic marathons, and more historic rally events than most people could name in one breath. And the winning didn't stop there either. In 2022, a PV544 took the top spot at the Hero ERA Rack Rally of the Tests, a demanding historic motorsport event that punishes both cars and crews without mercy. Then, in 2023, the very same car did it again, becoming back-to-back champions against modern classic competitors, running far newer engineering underneath them. Almost 60 years after Joginder Singh proved every doubter wrong out in Kenya, that same stubborn design philosophy was still beating the field on tarmac and gravel alike. And people are still paying attention today, in ways that go well beyond nostalgia. Original Works rally cars from this era, cars that once carried factory drivers like Iwi Rosqvist through European Championship seasons, have sold at auction for well over €47,000, decades after they last crossed a competitive finish line. Even ordinary rally-prepared examples, cars built for club competition rather than factory glory, regularly change hands for over €20,000 today. That's not the kind of money people spend on a car because it looks pretty in a driveway. That's the kind of money people spend chasing a reputation that's been earned, mile after brutal mile, for well over half a century. Think carefully about what that actually means. A car mocked for its shape from the moment it first left the factory floor. A car built during wartime scarcity, not luxury or excess. A car that never once tried to look impressive standing still. And yet, it kept winning, decade after decade, against machines that were supposed to be better on paper, built by people with bigger budgets and newer ideas. That's the real lesson hiding quietly inside this story, and it's one worth sitting with for longer than a minute. Substance beats appearance every single time it's actually put to the test. What something looks like on the surface tells you almost nothing about what it can survive underneath the surface, when everything else has already broken down. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this story matters and why it's stayed with people for 60 years now. It's not really about a Swedish sedan from the 1940s. It's about every single time something, or someone, gets written off early because they didn't look the part on paper. Every engineer who got overlooked because their idea wasn't flashy enough. Every worker who got underestimated because their approach seemed old-fashioned instead of exciting. The PV544 proved that judgment wrong every single time it actually counted, in the mud, in the heat, and on the roads that broke everything else around it. And it kept proving it wrong long after everyone assumed the story was already over. So here's what I'm asking you today. If this story pulled you in the way it pulled me in, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Because there are plenty more true stories like this one still waiting to be told properly. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of this story stuck with you the most. The wrecked car nobody wanted, Joginder Singh's honest confession before the race, or the fact that this same design is still winning almost 60 years later. And if you genuinely enjoyed this one, do me a favor and share it with someone who'd appreciate a good underdog story, especially anyone who still remembers when cars like this actually ruled the road. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.